Reverend Sister Grace never had a choice. From the moment she could comprehend loss, it was already woven into her existence. Her parents had vanished from her life before she was old enough to ask why. Dead, missing. She never knew. No one told her. All she had was an uncle, distant, cold, and entirely uninterested in keeping her. The night he threw her out was etched into her memory like a scar. No screaming, no dramatic fights. Just a rough grip on her wrist, the door swinging open, and the biting cold that swallowed her whole. She was 13, a child with no home, no answers, and no one who cared enough to give her either. The church took her in, or rather the catechist did. St. Augustine Catholic Church became the roof over her head, and the catechist, the man who found her, became the closest thing she had to family. He fed her, gave her a place to sleep, paid for her education. He was a pillar of the church, respected, admired, and unquestioned. Priests came and went, but the catechist remained, holding the power behind the scenes, his hands in every decision, every secret, every whispered sin. People trusted him. And Grace? She owed him. Maybe that was why she ignored the way his eyes lingered on her for too long. Why she dismissed the unsettling weight of his hand on her shoulder when he spoke. Why she convinced herself that his excessive praise was nothing more than pride in the girl he had raised. After all, he had given her everything. Didn't he? The catechist's influence stretched far beyond the church walls. He was the one who led Grace to her calling, nudging her toward a future where she could belong to God alone. A place where she would be safe, untouched by the world outside. And she accepted it. What else was there for a girl with no past and no family? She believed in this life. She had to. So when she was ordained, she told herself she was whole. That this was what she had been working toward. That the empty ache inside her had finally been filled. And yet, something gnawed at her. A quiet, persistent feeling that something was wrong. Her first posting was to St. Augustine's, the very church that raised her, a homecoming. The congregation welcomed her with joy, embracing the girl they had watched grow into a woman of faith. And the catechist? He was proud. She was his success story. He stood beside her, smiling like a father watching his child finally become something great. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt trapped. Something in his eyes had changed that day, or maybe it had always been there, and she was only just seeing it now. Because the truth was simple. Grace had never chosen this life. The catechist had chosen it for her. When Sister Grace arrived at St. Augustine's, it felt like stepping into a familiar dream, one that should have been comforting, but instead felt suffocating. The people welcomed her with open arms, their joy radiating through the church walls. She was one of them, raised before their eyes, molded by their faith. The orphan girl who had become a Reverend sister. They celebrated her. The church choir sang loudly in her honor, voices rising toward the heavens. Women clutched their rosaries, smiling at her with pride. The men nodded in approval, whispering among themselves about how she had grown into a fine, dedicated woman of God. Children peeked at her shyly, giggling behind their mothers' skirts. She stood before them, hands folded in gratitude, but deep inside something was wrong. Why did it feel like she was being watched? At the altar, she gave her thanks, voice steady, posture poised. She spoke about service, faith, and sacrifice, all the things she had learned, all the things she had lived by. The congregation listened. The catechist watched. His eyes never left her. After Mass, Sister Grace decided to visit him, a bottle of wine in her hands, a small token of gratitude for everything he had done for her. He had taken her in, fed her, given her a life when no one else had. It was only right that she thanked him properly. He accepted the gift with a smile. But there was something beneath that smile, something she couldn't name. "Sister Grace," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "you have given your life to God. But do you understand what that truly means?" She nodded, though she didn't like where this was going. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "There is a passage that says one must reap the fruits of their labor. Would you agree?" "Of course," she answered hesitantly. "And if a man has nurtured a tree, watered it, protected it, is he not entitled to its fruit?" Sister Grace frowned. Something about his tone made her uneasy. "The fruit belongs to God," the catechist chuckled, shaking his head. "You are wise, Sister Grace, but wisdom does not change reality." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to change the subject, but his gaze pinned her in place. There was something about the way he looked at her now, something she had never noticed before. Had it always been there? She pushed the thought away. He was the catechist, a man of God, the man who raised her. It had to be her imagination. Still, when she left his house that evening, the back of her neck felt cold, as though unseen eyes were still following her. The days passed and she tried to ignore the feeling, tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. But she started to see things differently. The catechist was more than just an old man who had served the church for years. He was the church. He handled everything, the accounts, the records, the decisions. When new priests arrived, they depended on him to guide them. He was the one who controlled the finances, the land, the donations. If something happened in the parish, he knew about it. He controlled the whispers, the rumours, the truths, and the lies. And everyone respected him, feared him. The priests listened to him. The women lowered their gazes when he passed. The men shook his hand with forced smiles, careful to never step on his toes. His power was silent but absolute. And Sister Grace. Sister Grace had never questioned it. Until now. The catechist had his secrets. For 32 years, he had been the foundation of St. Augustine's, the quiet force behind every decision, every transfer, every whispered confession. The parish priest came and went, but the catechist remained, ever present, ever watchful. He knew where the bodies were buried, both metaphorically and, perhaps, literally. In the eyes of the congregation, he was a man of wisdom, discipline, and unwavering faith. The priest preached, he enforced. The faithful repented, he listened. He held their sins like currency, tucked away for safekeeping, never to be spoken of, unless, of course, it served his purpose. But power, even the kind draped in piety, came with its own hunger, and when the weight of righteousness grew too heavy to bear, he sought relief in places no one would think to look for him. This night was no different. The catechist sat in the back seat of a black Toyota Prado, the tinted windows shielding him from the outside world. He watched the city lights flicker past in a blur, the hum of the engine a steady rhythm beneath his thoughts. The driver said nothing. He knew better than to ask questions. The catechist never indulged in his vices within the town. That was far too risky. St. Augustine's was his empire, and empires only stood firm when their rulers were untouchable. Instead, he travelled across state lines, slipping into places where no one knew his name, where he could be just another man with money to spend and appetites to feed. Tonight, he found himself at La Rouge, a club notorious for its discretion. No cameras, no questions, just business. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of perfume and sweat, the bass-heavy music rattling through the walls. Neon lights pulsed erratically, casting a glow over bodies that twisted and swayed, limbs entangled in a dance of desire. He settled into his usual private booth, away from the main crowd but with a perfect view of the stage. A waitress approached, her dress tight, her smile polite but distant. She had served him before. She knew not to linger. "I need someone new," he murmured, slipping a wad of cash into her palm. She nodded, pocketing the money. I'll send you our best." And then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, she walked onto the stage. The catechist's breath caught in his throat. The girl was masked, her identity hidden beneath the soft glow of the stage lights, but he would have known that posture anywhere. The way she moved, the tilt of her head, the subtle grace in the way her fingers skimmed over her own skin. His grip tightened around his glass. It was impossible. The crowd was alive with whistles and applause as she danced, her body draped in silk and lace, her presence commanding. Yet, all he could hear was the faint echo of a hymn sung just that morning, a voice lifted in devotion. "O Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder." He swallowed hard, forcing his mind to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. And yet, she descended from the stage, weaving through the tables, her movements unhurried, deliberate. When she reached his booth, she slid into the seat beside him, her scent something warm and unfamiliar. He stared at her, his pulse hammering. She turned to face him, her lips curving in amusement beneath the shadow of her mask. "Good evening," she purred. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sister Grace." The girl stiffened, just for a fraction of a second. But he saw it. The hesitation. The flicker of something in her eyes. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Who?" "Don't play games with me," he said, his fingers tightening around his glass. His voice was steady, but his mind was spinning. "I know you. I watched you stand at the altar this morning, speaking of devotion, of purity. And now, here you are." She laughed, soft, airy, unbothered. "You must be mistaken. My name is Mercy." "Lies," he spat. She shrugged, sliding onto his lap as if nothing had happened. "Believe what you want. But I'm here to work, not entertain your fantasies." He felt her hands skim over his shoulders, her fingers feather-light. But the catechist was no fool. He had raised her, watched her grow from a trembling orphan into a woman of faith. He had seen her at her holiest, knew every inflection of her voice, every curve of her face. He reached up, gripping the edge of her mask. She caught his wrist. "Don't," she warned, her voice carrying an edge now. He smirked. "Afraid?" "It's against the rules," she replied, shifting off his lap. "Find another girl if you don't like it." Then, just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd before he could process what had happened. The catechist sat frozen in place, his fingers still curled around nothing, his pulse thrumming wildly. Had it really been Sister Grace? Or had his mind played a cruel trick on him? He called for another drink, but the burning liquid did nothing to silence the question clawing at his mind. If that was truly Sister Grace, then what was she doing here? Sunday morning arrived with the usual chorus of hymns and the steady waft of incense curling through the air. St. Augustine's church was alive with devotion, the faithful swaying to the rhythm of worship, voices rising and falling like waves against the shore. At the altar, Sister Grace stood in her pristine white habit, the picture of piety. Her hands were folded in front of her as she led the congregation in prayer, her voice unwavering, smooth as running water. To them, she was an untouchable beacon of faith, a woman devoted entirely to God. But in the front pew, the catechist sat watching her, not in admiration, not in reverence, but with certainty. A week had passed since that night in the club, 7 restless nights of torment, of doubt gnawing at his mind like a persistent rat. He had questioned himself at first, wondering if exhaustion or drink had made him hallucinate. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. The way she moved, the delicate tilt of her head, the rhythm in her step, it had to be her. Now, as she stood before him basking in the glow of the morning light, he saw it all over again. The same grace, the same poise, Sister Grace or Mercy. Which one was she? His fingers tightened around the worn edges of his hymnal. He needed to know. When the final blessing was given, The congregation surged forward, crowding around her with warm words of admiration and gratitude. She smiled at them, receiving their blessings, her expression as serene as ever. Liar. The catechist rose from his seat, weaving through the dispersing worshippers, his heart pounding with something close to fury. "Sister Grace," she stilled at the sound of his voice. Slowly, she turned. The catechist stood in the corridor, away from the bustle of the church. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something she could not name. "Come with me," he said. There was no room for refusal in his tone. She hesitated only for a moment before nodding. As a child, she had been taught obedience. Raised in the church's embrace, she had learned that questioning authority was dangerous, and the catechist was authority. So she followed him. The office was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the morning sun filtering through the stained glass window. The heavy scent of candle wax clung to the air, mingling with the mustiness of old books. Sister Grace stepped inside, standing near the door, her hands folded neatly before her. Her heart beat steadily, but there was something in the way the catechist moved, in the way he turned to face her with that knowing look that sent a quiet ripple of unease through her chest. He closed the door, slowly. Then he turned. "You were terrible last night?" Sister Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her features. "Excuse me?" "The club," he said smoothly, stepping closer. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about, Mercy." A sharp breath left her lips. "What?" He smiled, but it was thin, cold. "Drop the act, Sister Grace. It's insulting." Her hands clenched at her sides, her mind racing. He knew something. But what did he think he knew? "I don't understand," she said, voice carefully measured. The catechist circled the desk, settling into his chair. He folded his hands, his gaze never leaving hers. "I saw you," he said. "I called your name, and you walked away from me." Her throat felt dry. I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured. He chuckled softly. "You might be able to fool the others." He gestured toward the church, his voice thick with something like amusement. "But not me. The way you moved, the way you carried yourself, it was undeniable." A cold wave of dread crawled up her spine. She could deny it, swear before God that she had never set foot in such a place. But would he believe her? Did it even matter? "It wasn't me," she whispered. "I swear." The catechist sighed, leaning back. "Then you won't mind proving it to me." Her jaw tightened. "How?" His smirk widened. "Your madam, the one who runs the club, must be paying you well." Sister Grace flinched. "But what if," he continued, his voice silky smooth, "you earned something bigger?" The breath caught in her throat. "You're insane," she hissed. His expression darkened. "Am I?" He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can make this easy for you. You work for me now. No one ever has to know." Her stomach churned. "I have never—" "If you keep denying it," he interrupted, "I will expose you." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Expose her? For something she hadn't done? "They will believe me," he continued, his voice low and measured. "I have served this church for decades. My word is as good as law. And when I tell them what I saw, when I show them what I know—" He trailed off, letting the weight of his words settle. Sister Grace's nails dug into her palms. "You wouldn't." The catechist tilted his head. "Try me." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, with a sharp turn, Sister Grace strode toward the door. She yanked it open, stepping into the corridor before he could say another word. But even as she left, his voice followed her, soft and taunting. "You belong to this church because of me." She slammed the door behind her, but his words lingered. For the first time since she had taken her vows, Sister Grace was afraid. The catechist had never been a man to let questions go unanswered. For 32 years, he had been the quiet force behind Saint Augustine's, the shadow in the confessional, the whisper behind the pulpit, the unseen hand that kept the priests in check and the congregation in line. His power did not come from the altar nor from the scriptures, but from the weight of secrets. He knew things. He remembered things. And he ensured that no one, no priest, no choir member, no bishop, ever forgot that he was watching. It was this power that made his word law, his suspicions dangerous. And now, for the first time in years, there was something he did not know. It consumed him. The image of Sister Grace haunted him, not as the devoted nun who led hymns and murmured prayers, but as the masked woman who had danced before him in a place of sin. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it was her. It had to be her. But proof was what he needed. By midnight, he was back at the club, his presence swallowed by the neon-lit haze, the pulsing bass a stark contrast to the solemn silence of the church he had left behind. Here, no one bowed their heads when he passed. No one called him Sir or waited for his blessing. Here, he was just another man lost in the dark, chasing the forbidden. But he was not lost. He knew exactly what he had come for. He approached the bar, ignoring the press of bodies, the scent of liquor, the laughter that was too sharp to be real. He signaled for the manager, a woman who did not bother with pleasantries, only calculations. "You came back," she said, her voice coated in amusement. The catechist did not smile. "Mercy," he said, "I want her." For the night, the manager studied him, slow and measured. "She's not available for what you're looking for." He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the counter. "She is now." She did not touch the money, not yet. Instead, she lifted a brow. 5 million. His jaw tensed. "That's absurd. She's my best. If you want more than just a dance, it'll cost you." The catechist was not a man who bargained. In his world, his word was enough. But this was not his world. He did not come here to leave empty-handed. "Then bring her to me," he said. "As she is, masked." A long pause, then a nod. "Wait here." The wait was short, and then she was there, moving through the shifting lights, draped in silk, a mask concealing her features but not her. Not the way she moved, not the way she carried herself. "Mercy." She slid into his lap with a slow, practiced grace, her lips curling as she tilted her head. "Back so soon," she murmured. The catechist's pulse pounded. "I don't have time for games." She laughed, low and knowing, trailing a finger down his chest. "Then why are you here?" His grip on her waist tightened. "Because I know who you are." She froze. Not long, just a flicker of hesitation. But it was enough. In one swift movement, he reached for the mask. Her hands shot up, too late. He yanked it free and the world stopped. There she was, Sister Grace, unmasked. Her face was undeniable, the same delicate features he had watched grow from childhood, the same familiar softness, now stained with red lips and dark-lined eyes. A woman of God, dressed as a woman of the night. The catechist's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her expression hardened. "You've made a mistake," she said, voice eerily calm. The catechist's fingers tightened around the mask in his hand. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A quick flash. A picture. Proof. Sister Grace's eyes widened, and for the first time he saw it. Fear. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You are finished." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but she did not speak, because there was nothing left to say. He had won. The catechist had spent his life building his reputation, carefully crafting an image of authority, wisdom, and unwavering faith. But no victory had ever felt as satisfying as this. This was not about faith. Not anymore. This was about power, and he had won. The image of Sister Grace, or Mercy as she had dared to call herself, was frozen in his phone, undeniable proof of her deception. It didn't matter if she begged, if she screamed her innocence. The world would see what he saw. And once the world saw, it would destroy her. Morning came, bringing the usual peaceful hum of prayer within St. Augustine's. It was an ordinary day for everyone but her. Sister Grace had barely slept, the weight of the catechist's threats sitting heavy in her chest. She had prayed, God how she had prayed, for clarity, for guidance, for a way out. But as she stepped into the parish office that morning, she knew there was no way out. The parish priest was waiting for her. His face, usually warm and kind, was set in cold stone. Beside him, the catechist stood calmly, his phone in hand. And then, the picture. The moment it appeared on the parish priest's screen, the air in the room shifted. A deep, suffocating silence. Sister Grace's stomach twisted violently. "This," her voice cracked, "this is a mistake." The parish priest's eyes lifted from the screen, settling on her with something worse than anger. Disappointment. "Sister Grace." His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "How do you explain this?" She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. "It's not me." The catechist let out a low, pitying chuckle. "Do not insult our intelligence." She turned to him, rage bubbling beneath her skin. "You set me up." He simply smiled. The parish priest sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You were a child of this church, raised by it, and yet you disgrace the cloth like this?" "I haven't done anything." Sister Grace's voice rose, trembling. "I don't know who that girl is, but it's not me. I have never set foot in that place." He slammed his hand on the desk, making her flinch. "I do not want to hear it." Her heart dropped. This was it. There would be no trial, no chance to prove her innocence. The catechist had seen to that. "Leave your habit and your veil," the parish priest said, finality in his tone. "You are no longer one of us." Sister Grace stared. It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. "No," she whispered. But the decision had already been made, a decision she had no power to fight. The moment she stepped out of the office, the whispers began. The catechist had worked quickly. The picture had already spread. It was everywhere. The once loving congregation, the people who had clapped for her, praised her, called her their own, now turned away. Mothers shielded their children from her. Men scoffed. Women spat at her feet. Prostitute. Liar. Hiding behind a veil of holiness. She wanted to scream, wanted to shake them, make them see her, hear her, believe her, but no one wanted to listen. Not anymore. She walked through the streets, her steps unsteady, the fabric of her habit still clutched in her hands. Tears blurred her vision. Her life was gone. Everything she had ever known, gone. And the worst part? She still didn't understand why. The face in that picture was hers. But she had never been there. Had she? A horrible thought crawled into her mind, a thought so impossible that she almost dismissed it. What if? No, it couldn't be. And yet, as she disappeared into the shadows of the city, a single question remained. Who was Mercy? And why did she have her face? Sister Grace wandered aimlessly, the cold night air biting at her skin. The streets blurred past her, faces turning away, whispers still clawing at her back. Prostitute, liar, shame. She clutched her habit to her chest, her mind spinning. The image on the catechist's phone haunted her, her face painted in makeup staring back at her from a world she had never stepped into. She had never been to that club. Had she? Doubt slithered into her mind like a snake. What if she had gone and forgotten? What if there was a part of her that led a life she knew nothing about? Number impossible. And yet, the girl in that photo, Mercy, was her in every way, every single way. Sister Grace stopped walking, her breath uneven. This wasn't a coincidence. She pressed a trembling hand against her forehead, trying to force away the confusion, the fear. But deep down, something inside her knew. There was more to this. The catechist had won. He had destroyed her. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that he had also opened a door. one she was now determined to walk through, because if there was another woman out there with her face, she had to find her. And when she did, the truth would change everything. To be continued. Stay tuned for part 2. Make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment below